Apple's board of directors fired Steve Jobs from his own company. The year was 1985, and the 30-year-old co-founder who had built Apple from nothing sat stunned as his own executives chose his rival John Sculley over him. They stripped him of all operational control and left him with an empty office and a meaningless title. How does the man who created the personal computer revolution get kicked out of his own empire? Steve Jobs started Apple Computer in 1976 with Steve Wozniak in his parents' garage. Their first computer, the Apple I, sold for $666.66 each. Within 4 years, Apple went public in the largest IPO since Ford Motor Company. Jobs was worth $200 million at age 25. But success bred conflict. Jobs demanded perfection from everyone around him. He called products shit in public meetings. He told engineers their work was garbage and needed to be completely rebuilt. Employees either worshipped him or feared him. There was no middle ground. The breaking point came with the Lisa computer in 1983. Jobs poured $50 million into development, insisting on revolutionary features that drove costs through the roof. The Lisa launched at $9,995 when competitors sold for $3,000. Sales were catastrophic. Apple lost $60 million in the first year. The board panicked. They needed someone who understood business, not just vision. In April 1983, they recruited John Sculley from Pepsi Cola as CEO. Jobs famously asked him, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Sculley took the job, but he and Jobs clashed immediately. Jobs wanted to cannibalize successful products to launch revolutionary new ones. Sculley wanted steady profits and predictable growth. Jobs saw Sculley as a bean counter who didn't understand technology. Sculley saw Jobs as a brilliant but reckless visionary who could destroy the company. The war escalated through 1984. The Macintosh launched with a $1.5 million Super Bowl commercial, but sales disappointed. Jobs blamed the marketing team. The marketing team blamed Jobs for creating a computer that was too expensive and too limited. Sculley sided with the marketing team. By early 1985, Apple's stock had fallen 40% from its peak. The board lost faith in Jobs' leadership. They whispered about his management style, his impossible demands, his tendency to scrap months of work on a whim. The company was burning through cash with no clear direction. The final confrontation happened in May 1985. Jobs tried to stage a boardroom coup while Sculley was traveling in China. He met secretly with board members, trying to convince them to fire Sculley and reinstate him as CEO, but someone leaked the plot to Sculley. Sculley flew back immediately and called an emergency board meeting. He presented the directors with an ultimatum: it's either him or me. The vote wasn't even close. Every single board member sided with Sculley. They stripped Jobs of all operational duties and left him with the hollow title of chairman with no real power. Jobs felt completely betrayed. These weren't strangers or corporate raiders. These were people he had handpicked, mentors he had trusted, friends he had made wealthy. Arthur Rock, who had been like a father figure to him, voted against him. Mike Markula, Apple's first major investor and Jobs' longtime supporter, voted against him too. The press was brutal. Fortune magazine called it one of the most dramatic falls from grace in corporate history. The Wall Street Journal wrote that Jobs had been outmaneuvered by a superior corporate politician. Businessweek ran a cover story titled "The Fall of Steve Jobs," with his picture and a red arrow pointing downward. Jobs spent the summer of 1985 in agony. He had no real job at Apple but couldn't bring himself to leave. He would drive to Apple campus and sit in the parking lot watching employees go about their work without him. The man who had been the face of Apple was now irrelevant to its daily operations. In September 1985, Jobs finally resigned from Apple. His resignation letter was brief and bitter. "I am resigning as chairman of the board. I hope that throughout the transition period, we can maintain a positive and creative relationship." But privately, he was devastated. Sculley and the board thought they had solved their problem. Apple would now be run by professionals, not mercurial visionaries. They could focus on steady growth and predictable profits. They had no idea they just made the biggest mistake in corporate history. Jobs used his Apple stock to fund a new computer company called Next. He recruited 5 key Apple employees to join him, including the head of engineering and the head of marketing. Apple sued him for corporate raiding, claiming he had stolen trade secrets and violated his fiduciary duties. The lawsuit was ugly and personal. Apple's lawyers painted Jobs as a vindictive ex-employee trying to destroy his former company. Jobs' lawyers argued that he had every right to start a new business and hire talented people. The lawsuit dragged on for months, generating hostile headlines and deepening the animosity between Jobs and his former colleagues. Next struggled from the beginning. Jobs insisted on the same perfectionist approach that had caused problems at Apple. The computers were revolutionary, but expensive. The Next Cube cost $6,500 when launched in 1988, pricing it out of most markets. Total sales never exceeded 50,000 units. Meanwhile, Apple thrived initially without Jobs. The Apple II continued generating massive profits. New products like the LaserWriter printer created entire new markets. Revenue grew from $1.9 billion in 1985 to $5.3 billion in 1990. The board felt vindicated in their decision to remove Jobs. But by the early 1990s, Apple began struggling. Microsoft's Windows operating system was gaining ground against the Mac. Dell and other PC manufacturers were offering cheaper alternatives. Apple's market share in personal computers dropped from 16% in 1985 to 8% in 1990 to just 3% in 1995. The company went through 3 different CEOs between 1993 and 1997. John Sculley was forced out in 1993. His successor, Michael Spindler, lasted until 1996. Gil Amelio took over but was fired after just 17 months. Apple was losing money, market share, and relevance. Industry experts predicted bankruptcy within months. In desperation, Apple's board looked for solutions. They considered selling the company to IBM or Sun Microsystems. They discussed licensing the Mac operating system to other manufacturers. Nothing worked. Apple needed a new operating system to replace the aging macOS, but their internal development projects had failed repeatedly. Then someone suggested acquiring Next Computer. Jobs' company had never been commercially successful, but it had developed sophisticated software that Apple desperately needed. In December 1996, Apple announced it would buy Next for $429 million and bring Steve Jobs back as an advisor. Jobs returned to Apple as interim CEO in July 1997. The company he co-founded was 90 days from bankruptcy. Market capitalization had fallen to $3.5 billion. Employee morale was at rock bottom. The product line was confusing and bloated. Everything he had predicted about professional management had come true. But Jobs was no longer the 30-year-old impulsive Jobs who had been fired 12 years earlier. He had learned hard lessons about leadership, management, and corporate politics. He still demanded excellence, but he was more strategic about how he achieved it. He had been humbled by failure and strengthened by adversity. The turnaround was swift and dramatic. Jobs killed dozens of marginal products and focused on a few revolutionary ones. The iMac launched in 1998 and sold 2 million units in its first year. The iPod followed in 2001, creating an entire new market for digital music players. The iPhone in 2007 redefined the smartphone industry. By 2011, Apple had become the most valuable company in the world, with a market capitalization of $351 billion. The garage startup that had fired its co-founder was now worth more than Microsoft and Google combined. Jobs had achieved the ultimate vindication against every person who had voted against him. The board members who fired Jobs lived to see their mistake. Arthur Rock admitted in later interviews that removing Jobs was the wrong decision. Mike Markula acknowledged that Apple lost its way without its co-founder's vision. John Sculley himself said that firing Jobs was his biggest regret. Steve Jobs transformed his greatest humiliation into his greatest triumph. The firing that devastated him at 30 became the experience that prepared him to save Apple at 47.